Thank you very much and good evening. Thank you to the organizers of the event. I feel very privileged to be here tonight. I also feel very humbled by the speakers before me. And I'll try in a short time we have give you a brief overview and perhaps contextualize some of the things that my predecessors talked about. I'm working in London office and we have operations in 120 countries around the world. Now, UNHCR is not really a charity. It is a UN body. It was created in the aftermath of the Second World War with one purpose. It was meant to deal with the refugee crisis in Europe after the Second World War, and it was meant to be a temporary organization. It was meant to end after about 4 years. However, the history has proven the founders wrong, and in fact, the UNHCR has gone on for years and years, and in fact, its first emergency after the Second World War was again in Europe. It was in 1956 with the Soviet invasion of Hungary, and then it continued on to the many of the crises in Africa, Middle East, and Asia. The mandate is a very simple one. It is meant to assist and protect refugees and to work with the governments to find solutions for the refugee plight. It has been doing so for the past 65 years. It has also, for its work, it has won 2 Nobel Peace Prizes, and obviously something that we are very proud of. Before I dive into Syria, a few words about the times we live in. And we live in times when the global forced displacement is at its highest levels in the post-World War II era. Not just in the post-World War II era, but since the Second World War, there is actually currently nothing on the record that we can compare things to. And to put that in perspective, this is the 65.3 million people who are currently in the situation of forced displacement. It includes more than 20 million refugees, 21.3 million, about 40.8 million people in the situation of internal displacement. And these are the people who have fled their homes, who are in a refugee-like situation, but they have not crossed an international border, i.e. they have not sought asylum, they have not looked for protection beyond their country's borders. And then there are 3.2 million asylum seekers awaiting their decision on protection. This is today's reality. Now, a lot of this has been driven by Syria. But just to make a point that over the past 5 years, there have been 15 new or old conflicts that reignited. And these graphs tell also an interesting story. We don't like to talk about refugees in numbers and don't like to tell that story. But here, the numbers also speak a very powerful story. And what they say is essentially this: there is a serious deficit of peace in the world today. It speaks of inability of the international community to prevent new conflicts, but also equally it speaks of its inability to end the long-term ones. Namely, in the case more here would be Afghanistan, the countries also like Somalia, etc. But also the new conflicts that have sparked up over the past recent period. Look at the situation with Ukraine, Yemen, Burundi again, etc. It is important to bear this in mind because refugees are people who are fleeing conflict, wars, violence, and persecution. And what they need safety, they need shelter, they need protection. Speaking of Syria, I can describe the situation in Syria in 3 words. It's death, it's destruction, and it's displacement. And it has been going on now for more than 5 years. The international community has left the situation in Syria to fester for this long. As a result, half of the country is in the situation of displacement. There is not a town or a city inside Syria that has not been touched by the war. Hundreds of thousands of homes, as we were able to see in some of the footage, shown earlier, have been destroyed. There are the entire neighborhoods, and one, for example, just to illustrate the point, this is satellite imagery of one of the Syrian cities, one of the neighborhoods in Hama in September of 2012. It took less than 2 months to reduce it to this. This is as if you're looking at a lunar surface. So when you start thinking about people who are leaving Syria, these are the conditions they are fleeing from. The war has been ultimately brutal. Not to go back to the death toll, which is in the hundreds of thousands of people, but to also understand what kind of impact this is having on the society, on the structure, the very fabric of the Syrian society. The hospitals no longer offer places of healing. The schools are no longer places where children can learn. And essentially, with now nearly 5 million Syrians displaced in the neighboring countries, and I've updated this map today, this is where we are today. There are 4.8 million people, Syrians, who live as refugees in the neighboring countries, the largest number of them in Turkey. In Lebanon, where when compared to the number of people living in Lebanon, essentially there is 183 Syrian refugees to 1,000 people in Lebanon. That's essentially 1 in 5 people currently living in Lebanon are Syrian refugees. There are more Syrian refugee children in schools in Lebanon than Lebanese children. Jordan is the country with sixth country in the world when it comes to scarcity of water. The 655,000 refugees there, it's about 10% of the Jordanian population. Turkey has become last spring the country with the largest refugee population in the world, and the Syrians have become the largest refugee group internationally. That sad record was held by Afghans for the past 33 years. It took less than 5 years of the intensity and the scale of the Syrian conflict to push the numbers this high. All this speaks of immense human cost and human suffering, because behind every single digit on this map there is a story some of the people are lucky and they have their stories heard, but there are many more who have not been heard. And in that sense, for UNHCR as the agency that leads the international response for Syrian refugees, it has been crucial to continue to advocate for open borders for the neighboring countries, so that people who are fleeing the conflict are able to leave the country, for the humanitarian access inside the country, for the safety passage for the civilians, for the support for the countries neighboring Syria, as much as also for the refugees themselves. Make no mistake, the real burden of this crisis is being borne by the neighboring countries, not by Europe, which has received over 1 million arrivals last year. But compared to this, obviously, there was a lot of attention to this. But there was also what we have seen in Europe throughout 2015. There was an overwhelming outpour of support, but there were equally reactions where states were building fences and borders, trying to portray refugees in a negative light, demonizing people, politicizing them, etc., which really, sheltering people who are fleeing for their lives, who are fleeing torture, rape, murder, is not an act of charity. It is a moral and a legal obligation that we all have, and it's a common thing to our common humanity. But just to bring it to the last point, and not to belabor also many of the things that my colleagues have said tonight. It's worthwhile bearing in mind that from all of the numbers I've given you, close your eyes and imagine that half of these people are children, which speaks of the immense cost that the young generation suffers and the kind of suffering that they are going through. The girl on the picture, her name is Aya. She was the 1 millionth child who fled Syria. This was in late summer of 2013. She was 8 years old at the time, so now she's about 10. She's the only child in her family who will not see school because her father cannot afford for another child to go to school, as he's now a refugee. They're in a refugee camp in a Bekaa Valley. He can't afford some money for the school bus, etc. She desperately wants to be a pediatrician. She wants to help other children. And you can see her in two ways. She can be either the embodiment of the Syria's lost generation, or she can be Syria's future. That depends on our response. Thank you very much.